The Church in the DR Congo, A Personal Perspective. Part 10, The Temple 3, A Light to the World. In this episode, I will discuss why the temple is a light to the DR Congo and to the world. This special significance of light goes back to the first day of creation, when God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. In this sublime depiction by Michelangelo of the fourth day of creation, God dramatically extends his arms in opposite directions, majestically assigning the golden ball of the sun to rule the day and the gray moon to rule the night. The nature of the light created on the first day is not explained. Several possibilities have been suggested. Some readers see this event as consonant with the prevailing scientific view that describes the birth of our universe as a sudden burst of light and energy of unimaginable scale. Others see this phrase as referring to a local event whereby the natural light of the sun was created. In contrast to such naturalistic readings, Hugh Nibley's interpretation seems more consistent with the related scriptural passages, namely that the light referred to was the result of God's presence. Quote, "All this time the gods had been dwelling in light and glory, but the earth was dark. This was not the first creation of light. Wherever light comes into darkness, there is light." End of quote. In accord with this spiritual view of the light of creation, President John Taylor wrote that God, quote, "caused the light to shine upon the earth before the sun appeared in the firmament. For God is light, and in him there is no darkness." End of quote. D&C 88, 12, and 13 augments this description to make it clear that this light is something over and above mere physical light as generally conceived, since it not only enlighteneth your eyes, but also quickeneth your understandings, governs and giveth life to all things, and proceedeth forth from the presence of God to fill the immensity of space. As Isaac Watts expressed in a hymn of praise, quote, "In vain the bright, the burning sun, scatters his feeble light. 'Tis thy sweet beams, O God, that create my noon. If thou withdraw, 'tis night." The idea of God himself as the source of this special light echoes many ancient sources. For example, rabbinical commentators saw the light at the beginning of creation as the splendor of God himself, who, quote, "cloaked himself in it as a cloak, and it shone forth from one end of the world to the other." Some ancient sources assert that the heavenly hosts, variously described as including the angels, the sons of God, and or the souls of humanity, were part of the light described in connection with day one of creation. The idea that the heavenly hosts were part of the first light of creation is depicted in this magnificent painting by Previati. It was said that God's light filled the place of his presence in the heavenly temple. On earth, that light is symbolized by the Holy of Holies in the house of the Lord. As Margaret Barker explained, the brightness of the Holy of Holies was the light of day one, before the visible world had been created. Those who entered the Holy of Holies of the heavenly temple entered this place of light, beyond time and matter, which was the presence of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who alone dwells in unapproachable light. This was the place of the glory to which Jesus knew he would return after the crucifixion, "the glory which I had with thee before the world was made." In the Gospel of Thomas, Christians are described as the new high priesthood, who enter the light, and in that document Jesus instructed his disciples to say to the guardians of that most holy place as they sought entry to it, "We came from the light, the place where the light came into being." End of quote. Thus, in the symbolism of the temple, the Holy of Holies, corresponding to the celestial room of modern temples, is not only a place of light, but also the source of light for the entire universe. After a visit to Temple Square, a non-member friend asked me, if the temple is a place of light, why its window openings were small and narrow, giving its exterior the appearance of thick battlements. As it turned out, there is a scriptural explanation for both the thick walls and the narrow windows. With respect to the symbolism of the temple walls in Ezekiel's vision, one interpreter commented as follows, quote, "Of the outer wall of the house, which encompassed it round, which was 3 yards thick and 3 yards high, which denotes the separation between the church and the world on every side, and the divine protection which the church is under. If a wall of this vast thickness will not secure it, God himself will be a wall of fire round about it. Whoever attacks it will do so at their peril." End of quote. Of course, it is necessary to qualify this statement by emphasizing that the protection of the temple building, like the presence of the Lord that hallows it, has always been conditional on the righteousness of God's people. As Jeremiah warned the inhabitants of Jerusalem, quote, "Don't put your trust in illusions that say, 'The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these buildings.' No, if you really mend your ways and your actions, then only will I allow you to dwell in this place. Just go to my place at Shiloh, where I had established my name formerly, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel." End of quote. What about the windows of the Salt Lake Temple, veiled by curtains and sometimes blocked up by thick frames that reduce the potential for light to enter the building? A scriptural rationale for such windows is given in the description of Solomon's temple. "And for the house he made windows of narrow lights." This verse is a difficult challenge for translators, both because it is difficult to know from the description what these windows actually looked like, and more importantly, why narrow windows would be preferable to wide ones on a building that uses light as one of its most important symbols. As to the question of what the windows actually looked like, translators can only guess at the meaning of the Hebrew description of the windows translated in the King James Version as narrow lights. Not only are the terms themselves difficult to understand, but also, until recently, there were no ancient temple ruins in the Near East to which Solomon's temple could be compared architecturally. One ancient tradition implies that temple windows, in contrast to normal windows in ancient times, were narrow on the outside and wide inside. But other interpreters say just the opposite, that they were wide on the outside, but narrow on the inside, to deflect incoming arrows, as in this design for military architecture drawn by Leonardo da Vinci. My brother Jonathan Bradshaw, an architect who has worked on several temples and knows the structure of the Salt Lake Temple well, told me, quote, "I don't believe I can recall any temple designs that have wall openings that are smaller on the interior side of the wall opening. This idea defeats one purpose of having a window, to let the light diffuse effectively into the interior. A building owner would fire the architect and contractor for such a thing." End of quote. By way of contrast, most modern translations of the Bible take the Hebrew term that describes the windows as stopped up as meaning latticed. According to one source, quote, "The lattice window looked very much like a fisherman's net and was used in warm Middle Eastern countries. It was formed of reticulated work and highly ornamental. They also had hinges which allowed them to be open or shut. On very hot days, then the sun is kept out while the air is let in through the trellis openings." Finally, taking the idea of being stopped up to its logical extreme, John Monson suggested that this false window in a non-Israelite temple in Ain-Dara, Syria, dating to the same general time frame as Solomon's temple and sharing an architecture that is very similar to other major respects, might provide the best correspondence to the biblical description of Solomon's temple. More important, however, than what the windows actually looked like is the question of why windows that obscured light would be preferred to ones that let the light in directly and fully shine in. It seems clear that the purpose of the reversal in temples versus ordinary homes in Old Testament times must have been meant to be symbolic rather than practical. Designing ancient temples that differ in obvious ways from buildings of ordinary construction would have allowed the Israelites to reflect on why such an anomalous design was required. Here is a reflection that echoes ancient Jewish teachings on the subject, namely, that in the symbolism of the light that the temple gives to the earth, it is easy to see a direct similitude of the sun, moon, and stars in the Genesis account of creation. Quote, "And God said, 'Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth.'" End of quote. In reflecting on this verse, one might come to realize that it is the earth, not the heavens, that require such illumination. For this reason, both ancient and modern temples, designed to symbolize the order of heaven, are made to allow the light of the temple to shine out at night, while at the same time being furnished with opaque windows that occlude interior illumination from its earthly surroundings. Thus the temple's function is figuratively represented as giving light and truth, not receiving it from the outside. This is precisely the opposite theory of that which informed the design of Gothic cathedrals. In these cathedrals, the key architectural principle was to provide, quote, the entire sanctuary with a wonderful and continuous light entering in through the most sacred windows. End of quote. By way of contrast, according to ancient Jewish tradition, quote, in the temple the light was within and shone forth onto the whole world. Just as oil illuminates, so too the holy temple illuminates the whole world, as it says, and nations shall go by your light. End of quote. The modern apostle, Elder John A. Widtsoe, wrote similarly, spiritual power is generated within temple walls and sent out to bless the world. Light from the house of the Lord illumines every home within the church, fitted for its reception by participation in temple privileges. The path from the temple to the home of man is divinely brilliant. Every home penetrated by the temple spirit enlightens, cheers, and comforts every member of the household. The peace we covet is found in such homes. Indeed, when temples are on earth, the whole world shares measurably in the issuing light. When absent, the hearts of men become heavy, as if they said, with the people of Enoch's day, Zion is fled. After this long digression to provide context, let's now see what this specifically has to do with the DR Congo Kinshasa Temple. One of Sister Chris Gates' assignments, as she served with her husband Ed as a senior missionary, was to create a book documenting the history of the Kinshasa Temple and its construction. She was an inspired choice as a writer, editor, and designer. She asked me to help with the digital typesetting of the book. Sister Gates had proposed that a small drawing of the temple appear in the upper right-hand header of each page spread. As a first attempt at such a drawing, we used the stick figure-like silhouette shown here. Later, Elder and Sister Romney, our public affairs missionaries, introduced us to Brother Rodrigue Kabuya, a talented young graphic designer from Kinshasa and a returned missionary from the Republic of Congo. Both his ideas and his expert execution made a world of difference. One of the things we liked better about his design was its prominent door, an invitation for all to prepare to enter the temple. This was a major contrast to our previous attempt, a closed design that seemed to be shouting, "Keep out, no visitors allowed." Equally important was the dark background of Rodrigue's silhouette, which allowed him to create windows filled with light that radiated from the temple. A group of visiting authorities was expected in Kinshasa for October 13th through 15th, 2017. In the weeks leading up to the visit, the temple steeple became a focus of attention. Everyone was rushing to make as much progress on it as possible. We watched the light generated by the sparks of the welders on the steeple with fascination. They hopped nimbly from joint to joint as they worked, seemingly enjoying the process of attaching the steeple as much as the observers did. Progress on the steeple and the overall temple construction continued at an intense and prolonged pace until just before the visitors arrived. When that day came, workers at the temple site, including several non-members, were thrilled with the lengthy and very personal interaction they had with revered church leaders and their wives. Elder David A. Bednar, an apostle, Elder Garrett W. Gong, then a member of the Presidency of the 70, and W. Christopher Waddell of the presiding bishopric. In addition, Elders Hamilton and Palmer, then President and Counselor in the Southeast Africa Area Presidency, Elders Lono and Monga, Area 70s, and David Frischnecht, then Area Director of Temporal Affairs, were present. In the Sunday session at the Kinshasa State Conference, Elder Bednar recalled the joy of President Monson's announcement of the Kinshasa Temple, quipping that we could hear you cheering in Salt Lake City. However, sadly, in some places where new temples have been built, he said, this enthusiasm had faded too soon after temple dedication, due to the spiritual laziness of the members. This sad story, he said, is found in capsule form in Helaman 12:2. Quote, we may see at the very time when the Lord doth prosper his people. Then is the time that they do harden their hearts and do forget the Lord their God. End of quote. Elder Bednar pleaded with the congregation not to let that story become their story. I need your help because I've told the brethren that this won't happen in Kinshasa. Will you help? He said he believed that if there is a place on earth where the people won't take the blessings of the temple for granted, it's here and in other places in Africa. I prayed in my heart that his hope and his prophecy would come to pass. When Kathleen and I left the site, late on the night of Elder Bednar's visit, the peaceful sight of this temple with its windows lighted by the workers inside resembled a real-life version of the silhouette by Brother Rodrigue, a beautiful sign of benediction on a blessed day. In the dedication for the preaching of the gospel in the DR Congo, Elder Marvin J. Ashton had spoken truly when he prayed, quote, that in the days to come great multitudes will enjoy the priceless gifts available to those who embrace and live the true gospel of thy Son, Jesus Christ. May thy earthly kingdom roll forward now in this country with stability, love, and eternal purpose. End of quote. Since the fall of Adam and Eve, the light of God's presence no longer fills the whole earth. However, it has not been completely withdrawn. In a movement similar to the divine concealment that the Lurianic Kabbalah terms contraction, the fullness of God's light and glory is, as it were, concentrated in one place, the temple, which continues to represent in microcosm the image of what will someday again become the model for a fully renewed creation, happy in the divine rest of a perpetual Sabbath. Until that day, however, the temple remains, in the words of John Levinson, quote, to space what the Sabbath is to time, a recollection of the protological dimension bounded by mundane reality. It is the higher world in which the worshiper wishes he could dwell forever. The temple is the moral center of the universe, the source from which holiness and a terrifying justice radiate to the dark and fallen world that surrounds it. Fittingly, just as the first book of the Bible, Genesis, recounts the story of Adam and Eve being cast out from the garden, its last book, Revelation, prophesies a permanent return to Eden for the sanctified. In that day, the veil that separates man and the rest of fallen creation from God will be swept away, and all shall be done in earth as it is in heaven. In the original Garden of Eden, there was no need for a temple, because Adam and Eve enjoyed the continual presence of God. Likewise, in John's vision, there was no temple in the holy city, for the temple is the Lord God. To re-enter the renewed garden at that happy day is to return to the original spiritual state of immortality and innocence through forgiveness of sin, and to know the oneness that existed at the dawn of creation, before the creative processes of division and separation began. The premortal glory of the righteous shall then be added upon, as they receive a fullness of the blessings of sanctification, coupled with eternal glory, which glory we do not now enjoy. Linda McCarthy's elegant digital watercolor shown here depicts the heavenly and earthly cities of Zion at the return of Enoch's people, mutually reflecting their serene splendor. In describing such transcendent scenes, words fall short, and it becomes necessary to rely on the transporting power of music. I first became acquainted with Elder Rafara Havotra, a full-time missionary from Madagascar, when he shyly entered my office and humbly answered my request for him to sing a favorite hymn. We will conclude this episode by his impromptu version of Jesus of Nazareth.
Jésus de Nazareth, Sauveur et roi, tu as vaincu la mort, donné la joie qui dans ton Père aimé, tu es venu. Seul tu t'es sacrifié